The sickle is placed so that the sharp edge is over her neck, over her throat. Now, this has been interpreted as suggesting that when they laid her in the ground, they took some steps to make sure that she wouldn't sit up again. Or if she did sit up again in her grave, the blade would cut her head off, if you like. And this is practice, ancient practice, that may suggest that she was regarded as a vampire, one of the undead, and that the people putting her in the ground were trying to make sure she didn't come back to cause further trouble for the living. It does tend to beg the question, how did she die? There are various ways you can make someone die that don't leave any evidence on the skeleton. Who knows? But in any event, she went into the ground and people went to some lengths to ensure that she couldn't come back. And it's as I say, it's from the 1600s, which means that the people doing it wasn't so very long ago, and people were acting and thinking in that way, and it's kind of it's like a timely reminder. And this sort of behaviour, people trying to make sure that the dead can't come back, is ancient, and it's universal. It's all over the place. Right back in Mesopotamia, in the old world, you get evidence of this. Some of the oldest comes from territory that we would regard as Greek, but from so long ago that there was no such place as Greece. We're talking about the Neolithic period, so the very advent of the very beginning of farming. As much as 4,500 years BC, archaeologists have found bodies buried, then with heavy objects like millstones, stones for grinding corn or wheat, placed on top of them as though to hold them in place. There are elsewhere at different times, definitely in that part of the world, Byzantine Greece, Ottoman Greece, but all over the place, you get bodies that are being held down. Sometimes holes have been made in the legs or the arms or the pelvis so that wooden stakes or metal pins can hold them against the ground. At other times, activity that's found in the way that bodies have been treated has been interpreted as people taking precautions. You get the head cut off of the body and placed maybe between the legs or down at the feet. You get legs cut off from torsos. There's been many instances of bodies cut in half and the two halves placed parallel side by side, and all of these things are interpreted as people taking steps to make sure that bodies can't come back. It's very much part of Greek and ancient Greek and even pre-Greek culture. Vrykolakas is the name that was given in ancient times to those who it was believed had lived sacrilegious lives. They had, whatever their behaviour in life had suggested that they were not normal, that they lived differently, behaved differently, and the suspicion was that those people, once buried, would come back as vrykolakas, monstrous creatures who, rather than drinking blood in the traditional way of a vampire, ate flesh. But they would come back in any event and kill and consume the bodies of the living. So the idea of a vampire is very, very old, and interestingly, it was often associated with the idea that it would spread, that where there was one vampire they might infect everybody else, so that you might get an epidemic of vampirism. And during in relatively recent times, in the 19th century, from time to time there were outbreaks, if you like, of sort of vampire hysteria. Various writers, John Polidori, who wrote The Vampire in 1819, Sheridan Le Fanu, who wrote Carmilla in 1872, and Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, of course, in 1897, and spawned he created the vampire genre, really, as far as most people alive today are concerned. But it's fascinating to consider how long these superstitions and these fears have been around. So it got me thinking as well about other ways in which people who attract the wrong kind of attention can be dealt with in the most appalling ways. As recently as 1782, a woman was put to death in Switzerland, having been convicted of witchcraft. You know, so as well as vampires, fear of witches is old. The woman in question in Switzerland was called Anna Goldie. Because of all this myth-making around her on account of the way in which she died, it's difficult to be sure about her earlier life, but she seems to have been born around 1734. At some time in her late teens or early 20s, she had a child out of wedlock, and she was punished for that. Then she was driven away from her community. Then there was another child again while she was unmarried. Eventually she turns up in a place called Glarus in Switzerland, and she was employed by a well-to-do family called the Tschudi family. Jacob Tschudi was the local magistrate, so he was an influential, powerful man. He was married, he had children, and Anna came into that household as the nanny, someone to look after the children. Then what happened becomes murky. It seems highly likely. She was a very attractive woman, according to accounts. You know, she was tall and she had long, dark hair. She was voluptuous, a very desirable woman. And the suspicion is that there may have been an affair. It's as old as the hills, really, isn't it? You know, between the man of the house and the nanny. It's an old story. And then at some point, if there had ever been any genuine affection, it was over, and Anna was put out of the house, sacked, and made homeless. And in the aftermath, there were tales of the children started telling tales that they had been finding pins, metal pins in their milk, and metal pins in the bread. And that's activity associated with witchcraft. That's the behaviour of witches making mischief. It seems at least believable from our perspective that Anna, perhaps having been sacked, went back to the family home and maybe made some threats, maybe delivered some ultimatums about what she was going to do to get her own back. And so Jacob Tschudi brought down the full force of the law upon her. And on account of the stories about the pins, she was charged with witchcraft. This is 1782. This is in the middle of the European Enlightenment. You know, in 1782, Britain recognised the independence of the United States of America. The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society were publishing reports about a meteor that they were observing in the night sky. Meanwhile, a woman is being charged with witchcraft. Anna was tortured. They hung her up by her thumbs till her fingers and shoulders started dislocating. And then when they cut her down, she confessed to having met with the devil in the form of a black dog. The whole panoply of confession that's required of a witch. But when she'd recovered a little bit from the agony of it all, she withdrew her confession, and so they hung her up again, and they did more to her until she confessed for the second time. And having confessed for the second time, she was marched out into the town square and beheaded by a man with a sword in 1782. You know, so as recently as, and then you consider here in Britain, in Pendle, in Lancashire, in 1612, 12 people were accused of 10 murders, and the murders were put down to witchcraft. And 11 of those went to trial, 9 women and 2 men, and 10 were convicted and hanged. It was just 7 years after the Gunpowder Plot, Guy Fawkes and all that, and it was a time of there was a lot of religious tension between Protestantism and Catholicism. Lancashire in the early 17th century was remote. It was far away from London, and it was regarded as a place of lawlessness and a lot of lax sexual behaviour. It was also a place of recusants, which is to say, by that time the Reformation had swept through, and it was illegal not to attend Protestant church services, and so people who were still practicing Catholic rite had to do so in secret, and these were recusants. So there was all sorts of religious tension. James the Sixth and First was on the throne, and he was famously interested in witchcraft. He believed actually that earlier in his own reign an attempt had been made to kill him using witchcraft. So he paid very close attention anytime anybody in his realm was charged with witchcraft. So it was against this backdrop that the Pendle witches were tried, and it's always in the majority women. Who were, from time to time it was men, but the vast majority, 70-80% of the people who were convicted of witchcraft were women. You saw the same thing happen in the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts in 1692, 1693. There were 200 people accused of witchcraft. 30 of them went to trial, 19 of them were executed, and of those it was 14 women and 5 men. These are not distant events. You might say, it's 400 years. It's distant in some respects, but in many ways, those events are only just really out of sight and out of mind. And it's always worth paying attention and bearing in mind these kinds of hysterical reactions that can whip up out of nowhere like a sudden storm and take people. And it is very often the case that it's women. That vampire burial in Poland in the 17th century. It's a woman of high status. Now, goodness only knows what that woman's life had been like, and what had been the events immediately prior to her death, and then her burial in those circumstances that she was being regarded as a vampire. Who knows who accused her, and who knows why she was accused? And look back at Anna Goldie in Switzerland. Who knows why she was accused of being a witch? But we know how it ended. And all those women in Pendle, and all those women, a majority of women in the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. You've got to. There's all sorts of complexity to those stories. The kind of women who were characterised at that time in the 17th and 18th centuries and earlier as witches, they were often wise women, or women who had acquired a knowledge of herbal and natural remedies. They may also have been women who were down on their luck. For women who had lost their husbands, that could cast a woman into an extremely precarious situation and position in society. A woman who no longer had a husband to protect her and provide for her could very quickly fall down through the cracks in society. Or women who had never been married and who lived a precarious existence, slightly ostracised from society. The very sort of women, friendless, defenceless, who when societies need scapegoats, they turn on them. Because who's going to protect them? Who's going to stand up for them? Happens again and again and again. So when there's scapegoating going on, who's going to be picked out as scapegoats? It's defenceless people. It's people on the edges of society. It's people that can readily be accused of something invisible, like making spells and consorting with the devil in the form of other animals. It's all very insidious and very sinister, but it's sinister running in that direction, not in terms of what the women themselves were actually doing. And I think about the longevity of fear and superstition. More than 6,000 years ago, you've got people being buried with stones to hold them in place. You've got bodies being cut up so that they can't move, legs cut off, people pinned to the ground. You might think, oh well, that's just ancient. That's ancient barbarity. But only 400 years ago or less in Poland, a woman was put in the ground with a sickle over her throat in case she sat up, so that her head would be cut off. And goodness only knows what she actually died of and why she went into the ground at all. And you've got to be, I always think in times when society's under pressure, and our society has been under pressure for a couple of years now, and people get demonised people were demonised. People were demonised for not taking vaccinations. People were demonised for not wearing masks. Even in the 21st century, you start to see hysterical scapegoating behaviour build again. And it's just important, I think, to be mindful of it. And remember that when the powerful feel threatened, even now, science and reason go out the window, as those people, often men, will do whatever they think necessary to get the outcome they desire. And people, the rest of the population, looking on in silence, they know it's nonsense. They know it's wrong. But there's a tendency to keep heads down and mouths shut for fear of drawing the lightning down upon themselves. So it's just that reminder. It's just that reminder that there have always been times throughout history when people are singled out for whatever, for not conforming, for looking strange, for not going with the orthodoxy, for not following the herd, and they get singled out and they are made into victims. And it's happened for as long as there's been a human species, and it will keep on happening. And it's incumbent upon all of us to pay attention.